We're now moving to our second panel, a tale of two Latin Americans finding the right balance to achieve equitable growth. The panel will be moderated by Mr. Oliver Cornock, who joined the Oxford Business Group in 2004 and is currently the managing editor. So please, Mr. Oliver, to you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, it's a real pleasure for me to be here to moderate this particularly dynamic and somewhat polemical discussion we're hopefully going to have on this issue of the duality, whether it exists or not even. There are 14 blocks, of course, in Latin America, so I wonder if we're oversimplifying this, and this is all what we're going to explore. My name is Oliver Cornock. It's my pleasure to oversee our Oxford Business Group's editorial output. We cover 38 emerging markets around the world and are openly very positive about emerging markets, despite some of the press at the moment, and have recently opened up in Latin America on quite a large scale. So it's an exciting and new market for us, and one that I have a great pleasure in overseeing. We're joined on this panel by four distinguished guests. Unfortunately, one of them has had to leave early. Jeremy Brown, unfortunately, couldn't be with us, the MP. However, we have His Excellency Francisco Perez to my left, Alejandro Puente, Rocio Velarde, and His Excellency Nestor Osorio. Forgive my pronunciation. One of the perils of having non-native speakers is the mess I make of names. Anyway, please store up your questions for the end. I'm sure you'll have plenty. I may take some questions in the middle as well, but if you could say your name and your organization before you pose your question, that would be great. And a question rather than a statement, please. So without further ado, we are going to be exploring this idea of Latin America, a tale of two Latin Americas, and what this means not only in terms of the current economic position, but what it means for trade, integration going forward, globalization, and also what it means for foreign investors looking in, what messages this sends to investors here in London, perhaps looking to work in the region. But before we get a discussion going, which I hope will be very lively, Friday mid-afternoon, need to keep everybody on their toes, I'm going to ask each panelist to just give a couple of vignettes, a couple of ideas about what they think of this proposition, whether they agree with it, whether they don't. And I'm going to start straight away with you. Perhaps you'd like to... Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. With respect to the initial question, that we have. I would like to mention or to make a quotation of President Michelle Bachelet, President of Chile, that last year in her inaugural speech in the seminar Dialogue on Regional Integration, Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, she expressed, I quote, "Because we know that unity cannot and should not be synonymous of homogenization. We are a diverse region, and we know that is also an asset. We have chosen different paths to development. We work with different political and economic strategies. We have focused in different ways our democratic challenges, and it is precisely this diversity of perspective which can give strength while a shared vision range on the world." I end quote. I think here we have different elements that we could focus on but let me stress the importance of reinforce the common points that we have in common in Latin America, and also the necessity to solve those issues that are obstacles to the economic growth and the social growth and inclusion. For example, let me say, without further review, the long-term thinking in the strategies. I think this is an important challenge. The transparency, corruption, infrastructure, income distribution, incorporation of new technologies, the strengthening of democratic institutions, education, violence, microfinancing, among others. So I just lay down these issues to continue discussion.
Sure, I'm sure we'll return to many of them. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. Very happy to be with these panelists. I think that we are under a very interesting proposition about what Latin America is. Are we talking about 2 or 3 or 4 Latin Americas? Our diversity is immense, and the differences between our countries are quite notorious. And this is a bit the reflection of what happened inside of our countries. It is the tremendous inequality that has always hampered the economic development and that has put the possibilities of the countries to increase their social inclusion, to increase their labor force, and to create an atmosphere that could put this part of the hemisphere in a competitive position. I think that these aims and these ambitions of integration that we have always had in the continent has been hampered because the lack of common denominators in the macroeconomic management of the countries, in the social participation in the life of the countries, and in the management of the institutions. Some of these concepts have already been mentioned here today. But since our task is to mention or to devise what are the, I wouldn't put it as challenges, I would put more like the responsibilities of our governments and our societies for the next 10 years, is to manage to get a more coherent society, is to manage to involve in the life of the countries more people in order to have more labor force, to create employments. And it is like that we will be able to continue to invite and to create spaces for the foreign investors and for new alliances. I think that in the way we are today is kind of an interrogation situation. Where are we? What are we going to do? Latin America moves from the lost decade to the decade of success, to the big boom of the commodities, and now we are facing a completely different situation. Nobody will have predicted a year ago that oil was going to be at $45 or $50 a barrel. Nobody will have predicted that the possibilities of normalization of the United States and Cuba were going to be precipitated in this year. And I think that this is going to change enormously the way the continent could evolve. This is to develop a little bit more, but I think that the proposition of some countries like the Pacific Alliance vis-a-vis the way some other more inwards economies are working, are creating the right questions to see how they are going to be answered.
Thank you. Alejandro.
Well, hello everyone, good afternoon. Muy buenas tardes a todos. When I first saw the topic of this panel, and it says that there was 2 Latin Americas, I see that there are not only 2 Latin Americas, there are 2 countries in each country of Latin America. And this is part of what the ambassador was telling, the inequality of the income in every one of our countries. And there are business models or economic blocks in Latin America. We have the ALBA countries with some business practices and political practices. And we also have the Pacific Alliance countries with another different business model. And for example, in just figures, some figures, the Pacific Alliance, just to compare, they have nearly $2.1 trillion in GDP, the 4 countries. The ALBA countries, they have $650 billion. I mean, the Pacific Alliance is 3 times the economy of the other bloc. And we can figure and we can look at the big numbers. But when we look at the small numbers in the GDP per capita in our countries, we see like in Mexico, for example, we have a GDP per capita of $10,000, a little bit more, $10,000 a year per capita. But we have 80% of the population has a $3,500 GDP per capita, 80% of the population. The other 20% of the population has $37,000 GDP per capita. I mean, the inequality, the gap between the societies in our countries is something we have to take on when we go doing investments, when we go to make to push some entrepreneurs in our region, how to make this inequality in our countries get closer, this gap to make it closer. And I believe there are huge opportunities in business in the region because there are a lot of needs. A lot of needs that if we attend them, we can close those gaps and we can make great business in our region.
Thank you very much. Ana Rocio.
Thanks, Oli. Good afternoon, everybody. Boa tarde. Buenas tardes a todos. What I thought that I would share with you is to bring a perspective of how the corporate world sees this tale of two Latin Americas. Working at a global bank, we see a lot of companies, corporations trying to invest and figure out how to make it work in these macro environments that are kind of bipolar, right? So the tendencies that we are seeing is that still there's a lot of interest in the region. Still, there are a lot of companies that want to come, do investments, that believe in the longer term of the region. Just as an example, the simple fact that I'm here for a roadshow that I'm going to several countries in Europe to talk about doing business in Brazil, doing business in Latin America, and what's the view of Citi, in terms of how to make this work. That's symptomatic of the complexities that we have to face, because the simple fact that I have to explain how to do business tells you that it's difficult, but it's also symptomatic of the opportunities that are being seen by the investors. So we are facing interesting times in the region. We have countries that have different levels of development, different levels of evolution, and different views of what the future should look like. So, and within each country, as my co-panelists were mentioning, there's also different views within the country. What is the better route ahead? Should we be more pro-market? Should we be more pro-state? Is there a healthy mixture of these two different views that could make it better for our country, for our population, and for those who are looking to our region as our investment focus? So that's a little bit, the view that we wanted to bring you, combine a little bit of the macro environment, how we see the macro environment, to the reality of companies that are either operating these days in Latin America, looking to operate in Latin America, or looking to expand their business in the region.
Thank you. I suppose as an observation, when we're talking about, very simplistically, this division between more pro-free market countries and those that are more centralist, left-leaning countries, some might argue that it's a very logical result of an inequality, a very unequal brush with economic success. But before we explore that a little bit, because I know you all want to, Brazil, Rocio, is Brazil left-leaning at the moment? What's your take?
It's it's very difficult to categorize Brazil at this moment, because if you see it's the macro direction the government is taking. It used to be more left-leaning. After the election, after the message that the population gave the government, we elected you, but we elected you by a very narrow margin. The government understood that structural changes needed to be made. The government gave an interesting signal to the market by choosing Joaquim Levy, a very pragmatic figure, very well respected by, I would say, the quote-unquote right wing of the market, that his main goal is to put in order the fiscal accounts and bring back credibility to the longer-term project of the country. So it's very difficult to put Brazil on a single box. And also you see Brazil is a country that is full of entrepreneurs. It's a bubbling economy. People that want to invest, want to grow, but face a very bureaucratic environment that challenges those interests. But nevertheless, people are there. We have a lot of companies that are coming to invest. They're a huge consumer market, and even though it's not easy to establish a company in Brazil, lots and lots of people are doing it because the market is so large. There's no short answer to your question. I don't know if anybody on the panel
Does anybody else want to
have a more pragmatic view than mine.
Well, you're there, so it's often difficult when you're in a country to actually really see. Anybody else got something to add to that? No? Alejandro, we were talking earlier about this disparity between the fiscal position, the monetary position of Mercosur and Pacific Alliance countries. And just looking at some figures I found from Moody's, inflation in Mercosur stood at 18.2% on average. In the Pacific Alliance countries, it was 3.6%. That speaks of a huge difference. To what extent are the Mercosur countries, the left-leaning countries, failing to get their fiscal book in order?
Well, I don't think that there is a recipe or there is a better way to develop the economy of a country, because the context in each country is very difficult. It's very different. We have in the continent we have different regions. We have North America, where it's Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Mexico, it's like it's very different than the two other countries, but it's more like Latin American country for some considerations, and for other considerations, it's like North American countries. Then we have this Central America region, where you cannot consider one country of Central America as a market. If you consider each country as a market, it's very small. So you have to consider the whole Central America and the Caribbean region as a whole market. And then we have South America. And South America, we have this huge country, Brazil, that it's in the region, but it's not really a part of the region when you talk about language, cultural, economy, many things that Rocío was just telling. So it's very hard to say which is the best model, what are if there is a recipe for the region. We have to take in consideration the context of every country, the cultural things, money, currency, technology, geography, many things to analyze each one of them.
I think that there is a point to be underlined here that is common to all countries, and it is a sensible management of your macroeconomic factors. The moment you put or you establish the parameters to put your house in order, to establish what your expenses are going to be according to the earnings you are having, how do you shape an economy that could give you a fiscal discipline that could create an atmosphere of confidence, of appeal to investors. Only when you manage to put those indicators in a certain order, then the country will be in a position to be a viable receptor of new business, of investors. If you don't have a fiscal discipline, you are not going to balance your accounts, and the country will be running into indefectible possibility or default or lack of possibilities of investments at the end. what our countries need to do is, via this fiscal discipline, via this low inflation, be able to create the necessary incentives for the creation of employments, to increase the exportable production, to develop the possibilities of industries of services like tourism that all our countries have amazing offer to make. So I think that in order to really face a future and be competitive, we are competing. In our region, we have 600 million people. That is what the Southeast Asians have. We are competing with people that are very disciplined, that are intensive labor, but we have the talent in our region, and we have these entrepreneurs that have been mentioned today. Those millions of people that are using smartphones are innovating and are creating every day new applications, new avenues. So I think that there are tools to be managed, and there are, in our position, assets to be developed.
Very fair. Would you like
No,
to add?
I agree with Ambassador Osorio, and those tools that we have on the region, and we need to incorporate in the economy, and also to give the framework, the legal framework for the startups and others businesses to have a positive impact in this number of inflation. That also we have to look from where we come to with those numbers, you see, because it's not that I think that the tendency is to a reduction,
Right.
because before was
Much
bigger,
Yeah.
much bigger, the difference. So I think we improve, but still we are further. We need to go beyond what we are now, I think.
Just moving on, both the ambassadors here have a background very involved with the WTO and trade. And I just want to look at quickly, if we can, at the various blocks. There are 14 different blocks in South America, as I understand it, from Mercosur, ALBA, all of these things. When we look at the European Union, when we look at even 6 countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council, any form of bloc has inherent problems with it. Why is there so many problems with the Latin American models?
Well, if I may, I think one of the
Are they just too different?
In my view, I think each of them respond to different moments in Latin America. I think the creation was that. I think the creation respond to a different circumstance, and the last one is CELAC, so that encompasses the Caribbean and all the region of Latin America,
Yes.
now the US and Canada. So I think this is the superposition of the different entities that are trying to promote the trade within the region is one of the answer. Then the results. I think the results, if we have 14 entities, something is wrong.
That's
And going back to the first question, the connection between Alliance, Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, well, here also there is a question of results and way of implementing the different trade policies.
Well, the story of integration in our part of the world is a long one, but I would say that the real one started in the 60s when the thesis of Raúl Prebisch about substitution of imports were part of the ABC of our countries. And then we started at different levels to try to see how those economies and those countries that have some affinities will be able to start with small groups of integration. And unfortunately, all of them have been have started on the basis of wrong assessments. the Andean group, for instance, that started in the late 60s, was based on a Colombian model of control of exchange. And we tried to elaborate and to develop a system that will control the exchange, that the balance of payment situations of many countries were a very difficult one, and to try to distribute a sectorial industrial production that never worked. And since then, the Indian group dies every 5 years and resurrects every 7 years. And now we are seeing that Mercosur is starting to do like that. Sometimes Mercosur appears like the formula. Other times said there are countries that say, no, this is not the formula. I'm very skeptical about a real and concrete economic integration about Latin America. And since you mentioned the WTO, and I spent 6 years as ambassador in WTO from 94 to 2000, was the good time of the WTO, and many agreements were reached. The multilateral diplomacy and the multilateral trade agreements is what will guarantee to countries like ours in development the possibility to have a better access to markets. Unfortunately, we have to face a very tremendous obstacle in the international trade, which is the subsidies of the European Union and the United States and Norway and Switzerland. We know who the protectionists are in this end. And agricultural subsidies are not going to disappear from one day to another, and that is our tremendous handicap and disadvantage from developing countries to develop countries in this matter. But what is important here is that if we manage to organize our economies to have a sound macroeconomic management of the country and to have governments that act not as obstacles to business, but the facilitator of business, we will be in business. Because if the governments do not realize that their role in the creation of wealth, which is the concept that we need to develop, the creation of wealth is facilitating to those who have the means and the capitals to invest in the countries, create the employments, and develop the economy.
Also, let me jump in. Well, I have a positive view of the regional integration. I think we have obstacles, but we can, and we have an enormous potential to be more integrated. The way forward, well, this is a challenge. And I think here I bring to the discussion the private sector, the role of private sector. Without prejudice of the role of the state, I think the private sector, and you can develop further the idea, but I think the important role that you have in generating the interaction between the different companies, this will push forward the public agenda as well. But it's not, if you leave all to one part of the equation, it's not going to work. And we are going to continue creating new entities, and the reality is going to in another way. So we need to bring to the table all the actors in order to move the agenda, to put the different rules on the table, to generate the space for social inclusion. I think this is important. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, and I think that there's a spectrum of things that the private sector can do in the lines of what you're saying, but it has to be a partnership, right? The macro environment and the rules have to be there for the private sector to be willing to take the risks and push the agenda. But I completely agree. Private sector has to be responsible, has to be defining we cannot be victims of what governments are imposing, right? The private sector has a responsibility to understand what's the environment in which we're working, what's the environment that we want, making sure that view gets to the government and within its means push that agenda and try to convince the the actors, the relevant actors, the relevant agents about what are the structural changes that need to be made. So, but just reinforcing your point, I think that private sector has an important role. We have to be protagonists of our own destiny. It's a cliche, but it's the truth. We cannot be simply victims of what's going on, but there are situations that take the population to extreme and take the private sector to extreme and completely disincentivize investment. So there has to be a good marriage of the priorities of both the private and public sector to make sure that the country moves forward and progresses.
Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that free trade agreements are very good, a great starting point for integration of the economies of the countries. But sometimes we believe that just signing a free trade agreement, it's enough. And it takes time. It takes time, it takes discipline, it takes cooperation, it takes a new way of doing things in regulation, it takes some risks, regulation risks, political risks, many things. Things are not done just by law, just signing a law, things are going to be done. We have to be, to collaborate public sector with private sector in order to gain goals with the free trades. I mean, the signing a free trade agreement, it's a great starting point, but it's not enough. We have to work on those agreements. And sometimes we have to change those agreements. I mean, in Mexico, we have, Mr. Fernandez was telling us this morning, nearly 70 free trade agreements with other countries and other regions. And we have to work with all of them. He also was saying that the 1st of January of 1994, we in Mexico, we woke up with the NAFTA. And many people from the private sector and the public sector were afraid because we have partners that were sharks, and we were swimming like little fish with sharks. We were afraid, but it takes time. It takes time. When things are done with discipline, as the ambassador was saying, we can achieve the goals.
And I think that leads on to a point in a second. But when you join, when you drop trade barriers, when you open your borders, unless your economy is inherently competitive, it could be disastrous.
No, and I think this is another point, the analysis. Well, we are going to enter into an agreement, but before that we have to do our own homework. And here the importance again of the marriage. But I will add another partner, so I'm not going to say marriage, but partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and the academy. I think the analysis of the academy to advise the private sector and the public sector is also an important, and I was mentioned as one of the obstacles, the long-term vision. I think here the academy can play an important role as well.
I think one of the interesting things that we were discussing, I was discussing over lunch, was the rise of these so-called multi-Latinas, these big, huge companies. I'm just intrigued, actually. How can they drive forward? When we look around the world, often big companies have driven big reform in economies. Yeah. In what sense can they drive integration, but also at the same time pave the way for greater levels of foreign direct investment and SMEs and things like that, the trickle down?
This is a very interesting point, because I think in many of our countries in the region, we are ready to make the South-South cooperation a reality within our continent and with similar countries in other continents. I think that the technology that we have acquired, that is still precarious, there is still a lot to be done in terms of acquiring the right technology, But with the global situation we have today, with more foreign companies present in different countries, and this is one of the beauties of the Pacific Alliance, is that without creating an institutional, heavy thing, we are like-minded countries moving in the same direction with the same thinking about how to do business. The four countries, we have the same trade agreements with the different blocs, with the United States, with the European Community, with Asian countries, and that is something that facilitates, because the government policies and the private activity could be matched and could be guided in the direction that is interesting for the business and is interested for the well-being of the people, because at the end, that is what we are looking forward to, have a much better situation for the people of our countries.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Pacific Alliance permits bilateral free trade agreements rather than Mercosur, which I understand doesn't. It has to be on a bloc basis.
Well, this is a big difference.
Yeah.
This is make a big difference, and well, my country also, Uruguay, is pushing to the consideration of the asymmetries between the members to move the trade agenda forward. Let's see what are the results at the end of the road. But going back to your point of multi-Latinas, and here how they can bring the integration, and I think they can play an important role. And here I add the incorporation of the small and middle enterprise in the global regional value chain that can take an important aspect here of this equation in achieving more economic growth and generating employment, and also putting on the public agenda the attention of the necessity to solve the challenge that we have.
Sure. Well, we are fast running out of time. So does anybody have any questions for our esteemed panelists? Anybody? The gentleman there. Yeah, your name and organisation first, please.
I had a quick question regarding, I don't think it's been spoken about much today. In the last 6 months, both the real in Brazil and the Colombian peso, for example, have lost about a third of their value. That's affecting both Mercosur and Pacific Alliance economies. And perhaps just a brief discussion of the impact that's going to have and the way in which Latin American economies will have to adapt to much weaker currencies in the future would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Brilliant. Well, a very good question, actually. Yeah.
Well, the monetary functioning is something that varies very much from country to country. In the case of Colombia, we had a long period of, I would say, more than 5 or 6 years in which the peso, Colombian peso, was very strong. And that was very diminishing for the exporters of the country. And there was permanent claims and permanent appeals to the government and to the monetary authority to try to do something about this matter and to try to create a situation in which a kind of devaluation could be put in motion. But of course, we didn't go back to the old bad practices of creating dual currencies or dual rate of exchange. And the market moved, and in a way, with the situation we are seeing today, the devaluation of the peso has been, in many respects, and it's been of around 20%, beneficiary and a kind of respite for a very powerful export sector that is in the country. In this, of course, it has been even a mitigation of the lower oil price, and that has helped a little bit. But nevertheless, the oil price has created a problem in the management of the budget that has put the government in the situation to stop the allocation of some resources for this budget. But the point is that in the case of some commodities and many of our countries were very dependent on the exports of some commodities. The moment you acquire more national currency for your commodity is an ease of the situation.
And for Brazil and the Brazilian real, I think the situation is very similar. Being Brazil a net exporter, the devaluation of the currency means that the exporters can be more competitive. The cost of doing business in Brazil is already high, so having a strong currency was a deterrent to some exporters. So in that sense, it has a good impact. It also, on the positive side, it also has a boost on local consumption, because when the real was very strong against the dollar, there were billions and billions of dollars of consumption, personal consumption that were going abroad to the US, Europe, etc. And now that the currency has devalued, the cost of buying goods abroad it's not as interesting as it was before, and it does have a boost for the local market and the local consumption. So it does have there's a positive side to the weakening of the currency, I think, in both countries.
Have you anything to add?
I just want to say a very brief consideration about this devaluation of the currencies. You have to take in mind that the devaluation, it's because you have a mess in your finances, or the devaluation, it's because of the market in the international markets. For example, the oil prices are hitting some of our currencies, but these devaluations, for example, in Mexico, are making a lot of people in Mexico to have much more money to spend, because they have more pesos coming from the remittances from the United States. So you have to take in consideration many things, but the most important, I believe, is that to take in mind that is there a mess in the finance, in the economic, how the management of the countries is going on, or macroeconomic or external factors that are hitting your currency.
But if there are more pesos in the pockets of the Mexicans, there will be more demand.
That's right.
And that will fuel the economy.
That's right.
I think it's important.
Absolutely. Yes, the gentleman there.
Thank you. Eamon Hickey from the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin. Your views, please, on the potential of the European Union-CELAC relationship, and whether, in fact, the potential of that relationship is hindered by the duality we hear about in the context of Latin America, and any views you may have on the potential of the summit coming up in June. Thank you.
Ambassadors, I think.
Well, I think that the relations of most of the countries of Latin America with the European Union have been improving and developing in a very, very positive way. In our case, Colombia and Peru, we signed together a free trade agreement that has been approved. It's in the last stages, country by country, before it is put into operation. And I think that for all the different alliances that we have been built in the past with the Ibero-American group, with the international bilateral relations of each of the countries, there is a mood with of working and developing relations with the European Union that is very, very important. And here I want to take one of the areas in which this cooperation is going to be a fundamental issue. We are entering this year, 2015, in what is called the post-2015 agenda, after 15 years of Millennium Development Goals, in which they were designed and meant especially for developing countries to upgrade, to eradicate poverty, to include more people in the education system, to diminish the rate of mortality, etc. Now, the post-2015 agenda is a more universal, inclusive, and implies commitment for everybody. And sustainability and environmental protection is at the center of all the, I would call, new economic model that is going to be practiced in the world in the next 15 years to come. And I think that with the resources and the biodiversity that our countries have, with the capacity to contribute to what is the sustainability of the planet, is one of the areas in which we hope that the European community is going to be a great contributor and a great partner.
Just to add that for Uruguay and for, I think, the majority of the members of Mercosur, the relationship with the European Union is very important, and from our country we are pushing as much as we can the agenda in order to make a deal with the European Union. I think it's very important because while we had lost some of the preference, and we need to expand or to get all the preference from an agreement with the European Union. I think this point is critical as well for many of our products. I think touching a little bit on the conference of post-2015, I think we have 8 big goals. Now we have more than 8 goals, and this is going to be an enormous challenge. I hope that we can focus on certain aspects to then continue the process of achieving the goals of the development of the world.
To what extent, though, is subsidy going to be the biggest stumbling block, particularly within the EU, thinking agriculture, things like that?
Well, it's going to be critical as is being at the WTO at this moment is one of the crucial points. Well, we have to see how it works.
I think it's the major stumbling block in the development of fair trade and in our quest to level in the playing field. That is fundamental, and unless we manage to make, if not a very rapid progress, at least to establish some rules. We managed to do that in the second part of the 90s when the Uruguay round was negotiated. There was a textile agreement to end with the multi-fiber and all that, and a 10 years term to dismantle all the tariffs and all the obstacles for the commerce of textiles. So if a modality like that could be put in motion with agriculture, of course, there have been some reductions of the subsidies, but not willing reductions. It's because the fiscal situation of the European community is putting them in a place of reducing them.
Oh, and to add as well, I think the majority of the Latin American countries, our economies are based on agricultural products. And to compete in the global market with this distortion is very tough. So I think this is also another key element that we need to remove or be consistent when we talk about free markets. When we talk about free market, I think these elements are distortive of this free market. So our aspiration is to eliminate or to substantially reduce in order to boost our sectors.
Excellent. Thank you. Any points on those? Any further questions? There's one, the gentleman here. Just briefly, if you may.
Thank you. Andres from Imperial College. So Ambassador Nestor mentioned the fiscal discipline as the key to bring above the common interest and over the personal views and the political parties that take advantage at some extent of the inequality in income and education. Which other key do you think is important to include in these agendas in order to bring this common benefit above anything else in the region?
Well, in our national policies, we have identified two fundamental areas in which we have to work in order to make the country progress. And this is to invest as much as possible in education and also to do the necessary investments and create the opportunities for the necessary investments for the social sector. We, as you know, we are going through a very special historical situation in our country, which is the peace process. And we are confronted with a situation in which it is not only a matter of obtaining a ceasefire, it's a matter of rebuilding many areas of the country and including in our economic and social life more than 6 to 7 million people that has been displaced because of the conflict of more than 50 years. So that gives you the dimension of not just signing peace with a group of guerrillas that are now more or less 6,000 to 7,000 persons. It is just to how you rebuild and you include people in society and create opportunities for them to work and for them to be part of the engine of the economy of the country. So I think that social investment and education is adamant. Of course, we are in a more, let's say, in more concrete investment that is necessary to create all this web or this network is the infrastructural one. Mm-hmm. A country without infrastructure is stuck. So we need to open those channels that are necessary to create the way to trade and move the people.
And we were actually discussing that a little bit before coming here. So the main points that we discussed were education. Of course, if you want social equalization, you have to give education to the people. Longer-term view. You know, we need governments that are committed to the longer-term project of our region and are not only looking to win the next election. And that's something that's a structural change that needs to happen in the way that we think and the way that we elect our governments, right? We also, as citizens of this region, need to commit to that responsibility that we also have, you know, to be agents of change, to feel responsible for not only leave this responsibility to the government, but also feel responsible to providing this education and providing the tools for collectively electing those governments that are committed to the longer term and not just want to put bread on the table of the people tomorrow. So an infrastructure is something that we need to really work on. The cost of you know, producing and exporting goods in several countries in Latin America, it's still heavy, it's still complicated. We have geographic location that it's benefited. We have access to major markets within from our region relatively easily, but we still have difficulty to move the goods, you know, from one point to the other, and the cost ends up taking competitivity from our exporters. So those were some of the things that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And that sadly brings us to the end. I suspect we could carry on once we got on to populist voting and things like that. We could have another hour here.
Yeah, I'm very passionate, so I could stay here for like...
Well, sadly, that brings this panel session to a close. We've spoken an awful lot about the challenges presented by this fascinating and dynamic region. But we've also spoken about the opportunities, and I think that's the take-home today. Like all good panel sessions, it's left rather more questions than answers, but that's a good thing. However, we've had huge insight from our four panelists, and I'd like you to join me in thanking them all very much for their time.